What about using cannabis and the cannabinoids for opioid use disorder? I'm Lex Pelger. This is the Can Education channel of CV Sciences, the makers of these fine PlusCBD products. For CBD, THC, CBD acid, PEA, and other excellent non-cannabinoid formulations, use a coupon code LEX for 30% off at pluscbdoil.com. So for cannabis and opioids, there's a long storied history here, plus a lot of data you can now see collected on the new Opioid Use Disorder page I created at CVResearch.info. So for this story, you could start it with Fitzhugh Ludlow, a personal hero of mine and the first great drug writer of the United States. In 1857, he wrote The Hashish Eater about his experimentations with strong extracts of cannabis that he accessed through working at a pharmacy. He wrote amazingly about its hallucinogenic effects as well as his later problems with dependence. His book transformed cannabis from another ingredient on the druggist shelf into a fabled psychoactive for self-exploration and fun. But it is after the US Civil War in the 1860s that his story became relevant to this one. With the widespread use of morphine during the war, it led to a great public health crisis of opioid addiction, often called the soldier's disease. Similar to today, doctors used opioids to help with pain, but it also became an on-ramp to addiction. Ludlow, who is familiar with both morphine and cannabis, theorized that hashish could help ease withdrawal symptoms and provide a non-addictive alternative to opiates. He advocated for the use of cannabis as a milder, non-habit-forming substance that could replace morphine, particularly for pain management. Unlike opium and its derivatives, cannabis was not associated with the same level of physical dependency, and Ludlow believed it could serve as a stepping stone to wean addicts off stronger drugs. However, he faced many obstacles. The cannabis of his day was not standardized, so the alcohol extracts you got on the druggist shelf were sometimes very strong and sometimes quite weak, even the same brand from the same company. Also, as you'll see in the data we'll share below, while cannabis is helpful for the withdrawal symptoms of opioids, it's not a silver bullet to end the cravings of opioid use disorder or to make the process completely easy. He found it to be a helpful tool, but it didn't work for everybody. Plus, with the medical skepticism of the day against psychoactive substances, especially those coming from India, despite his work at the national level to advocate for new methods to manage the treatments for drug addiction more humanely, the times went against him, and with his death at the age of 34 from tuberculosis, his work fell out of favor. But it was never completely forgotten. In the 1940s, when Mayor LaGuardia commissioned a report on cannabis, which famously found it to be not that harmful, Dr. Samuel Allentuck, among others, reported favorable results in treating opiate addicts with THC. And in this famous book of medical cannabis history, Dr. Todd McUria's Marijuana Medical Papers, which is free on internetarchive.org, he writes of a number of doctors from the 1840s to the 1940s who also recommended cannabis as a substitute for opiate dependence. And then by the 1960s, you have visionaries like the writer Ken Kesey saying, grass would help our drug problem. In sharing the data today, I'll concentrate on opioid use disorder. I initially was going to do all substance use disorders in one video, but it was just too gigantic. So I'll make more videos for things like alcohol and stimulants, but suffice it to say that a good bit of what gets said about cannabinoids for opioid use disorder applies to the others as well. So for the data, you can start with solid reviews about using medical cannabis to treat opioid use disorder, as well as CBD. As this review states, CBD has been reported to have several therapeutic properties including anxiolytic, aka anti-anxiety, antidepressant, anti-inflammatory, antiemetic, aka anti-nausea, analgesic, aka painkilling, as well as reduction of cue-induced cravings for opioids, all of which are highly relevant to opioid withdrawal syndrome. In addition, CBD has been shown in several clinical trials to be well tolerated with no significant adverse effects, even when co-administered with a potent opioid agonist, aka drug. For instance, in this double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized crossover trial, 600 milligrams of CBD isolate significantly reduced cue-induced cravings as well as attentional bias towards drug-related cues. Also, in this survey of people with substance use disorder who used CBD, they found that it helped them to sleep better, relax, reduce pain, and feel less anxious. Cannabis and THC can also help with the withdrawal symptoms of quitting. For instance, here's a paper with an excellent set of surveys of people in Los Angeles who inject opioids, and the researchers used one of the money quotes in their paper's title: "Smoking weed, it gets you over the hump." In a survey of German people in an opioid maintenance treatment program, almost half of them reported using cannabis as a substitute for heroin. In people using methadone, using cannabis helped to boost the efficacy of the methadone maintenance therapy, and it was also found that THC helped them with their pain relief. Similarly, a national US survey found a substantial number of US adults reported that they substituted cannabis for opioids, and this survey in Canada also concurred. Also in Canada, this survey on how cannabis helps people to manage their opioid cravings, as well as another series of interviews with people in early recovery from opioid or stimulant use disorder that had another money quote in their title. Everything is kind of the same, except my mind is with me. Also, the ability of cannabis to be a painkiller and to help opioids work better and lower their dosage, more on that later, is one way that they would help in the opioid epidemic. In fact, access to adult use cannabis has been linked to a per capita decrease of opioid prescriptions of 1 to 4%. Even the DEA's own data found a link between cannabis legalization and the reduction of opioid prescriptions. Though overall, this field of data is mixed, and you have other studies finding cannabis liberalization laws that cause no change in opioid prescriptions or opioid deaths, and even a few studies that find an increase in opioid deaths after cannabis legalization, though those tended to be during the pandemic. As you can imagine, the data on something this complex is messy. But if you look over the entire field, there's a general trend towards an increased access to cannabis causing a reduced use of opioids. Of course, when people think of substance use disorders, they often first think of dopamine, and this makes sense. In a recent genome-wide association study across 1 million subjects, the researchers found dopamine regulation to be the strongest genetic influence on whether someone had a substance use disorder. Dopamine and the cannabinoids is a complicated story, and if you want a deeper dive, read my article on Project CBD in defense of dopamine and endocannabinoid story, or read this review. But for starters, the CB1 receptor, which was the first discovered cannabinoid receptor in the human brain and the one responsible for the psychoactive effect, it turns out that the CB1 receptor forms complexes with the D2 dopamine receptor, and when these complexes are activated, they more effectively reduce dopamine release. Also, the two most studied endocannabinoid neurotransmitters, anandamide and 2-AG, regulate the output of the dopamine-producing neurons. And so with dopamine being one of the key neurotransmitters involved in addiction, its close regulation by the endocannabinoid system helps to explain why cannabinoids from the plant would be effective for substance use disorders. And for you neurochem nerds, surprisingly, it looks like the key receptor for treating substance use disorders is the CB2 receptor. The CB2 receptor is the one that is widespread in the body and acts as a hub of communication between your immune system and your endocannabinoid system. It's not normally found in the brain at high levels, except for when your brain has some kind of neural insult like a stroke or neurodegeneration or neuroinflammation. And opioid use disorder is a disease of brain inflammation. And it's well studied that cannabinoids lower neuroinflammation via the CB2 receptors. They even have several different pathways to do this. If you want to see more, here's a review covering 165 papers. One of the strongest ways is via the microglia, often called the guardian immune cells of the brain. And since opioid use activates these to increase brain inflammation, it's quite helpful that when cannabinoids activate the CB2 receptors on those microglia, this reverses that neuroinflammation. The cannabinoids also strengthen the blood-brain barrier, which, when weakened by opioid use, allows more inflammatory molecules to enter the brain. Finally, the terpene beta-caryophyllene, one of the most widespread terpenes in cannabis and also usually the most common terpene in our products, also has been shown in animal models to help with addiction via the CB2 receptor. This is why we always stress full plant extracts. And for a lesser known pathway of the cannabinoids, they also use the toll-like receptors 4 pathway. Opioids bind to these and increase inflammation, while cannabinoids inhibit their signaling to both lower neuroinflammation and also to lessen the increase of tolerance to opioids. This is one of the ways that for pain killing, cannabinoids help the opioids to work better and for tolerance to not as quickly develop to their effects, such as you see happen for fibromyalgia, neuropathic pain, which is one of the hardest types of pain to treat, cancer pain, or post-surgical pain, though the data for that last one is more mixed. And then you have this survey of chronic pain patients on how cannabis can be an off-ramp from prescription opioids. Of course, CBD is also potent for lowering inflammation and can work as a painkiller as well. Overall, there's a lot of clinical data on how cannabis and CBD can help people with opioid use disorder. It's not a magic silver bullet, but it's one more helpful tool that we're lucky to have. And the neurochemistry behind it and the work done in animal models backs up what we're hearing from all of these people. So, cannabinoids for opioid use disorder.